Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
Ah yes, fangs, frock, and an absurd accent. Dracula is the master of Western horror. The horror genre might as well be Dracula. Beside Frankenstein, there are a few things more synonymous with Western horror, despite the fact the Count was based on a historical personage and folk legends of Eastern Europe. Until the collapse of communism, only the Western Atlantic and Pacific were truly aware of the icon of horror. Notice, both Atlantic and Pacific. There are few characters as representative of their genres as Dracula. Bela Lugosi's 1931 interpretation of the Count is as iconic as the literary character, and Christopher Lee defined the Count's allure in 1958. Though it was not the Western world alone that was interested in flat taps. Japan, too, before and after the Second World War, developed an interest in Western horror and fantasy fiction. This was largely the result of one man, Hirei Taichi. While few know it, he defined Dracula in people's imaginations as much as Lugosi or Lee. Taichi's Dracula, though, captured the Japanese imagination, which eventually circled back to the West through anime and manga. The Japanese Dracula was not a reserved lurker, he was a bombastic villain out for blood. Quite literally. The Western Japanese vampire myth is all-encompassing, a style better represented than none other than Dio Brando from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Or just... Most may think Dio is a far cry from the iconic image of Count Dracula, but he's not. Not really. Dio inherited many tendencies of Hirai's translation. Hirohiko Araki himself is a professed horror fan, so why would he not know about Japan's most authoritative translation of this text? Or maybe this is all conjecture. The fact is, the contemporary vampire trend clearly influenced JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Phantom Blood, to some degree, but it goes far deeper than most would think. Phantom Blood is far more complicated than a retelling of Bram Stoker's tale. Dio and Jonathan represent a summation of the complex history that brought Dracula to Japan, then back to the West. So hold off on that judgment while we look for the proof in the Phantom Blood, but not the film. The Japanese fascination with vampires coincided with Japan's fascination with anything Western during the Meiji Restoration. Before then, the Japanese did not have a cultural equivalent to the vampire. Sure, they had bloodsuckers and creatures of undeath, but nothing like the vampire. As the Japanese examined Western literature, they came across the vampire and Bram Stoker's 1897 novel. Already attempting to imitate the West, Japanese scholars were fascinated by it. Even after World War II, this obsession carried on. The Japanese were so captured by the vampire that Tod Browning's 1931 film premiered in Japan the same year as Europe and the United States, under the title Dio and Dracula. The title may look a little odd because the Japanese language had no equivalent for the word vampire at the time. The word kyuketsuki is the best translators could muster. The word majin simply means demon or devil, which if one watched DBZ, they are probably familiar with. This confusion was only solved by Dracula's legendary translator, Taichi Hirei. Taichi's original 1956 abridged translation of the novel was titled Dio and Dracula. This was until The Horror of Dracula, or just Dracula in 1958, premiered in Japan as Kyuketsuki Dracula. Hirei's next expanded translation in 1963 adopted the title Kyuketsuki Dracula, likely to appeal to those who had just seen the 1958 movie. Now, Hirei is more important to the legacy of Dracula in the East than it first appears. During the 1947 occupation of Japan, Hirei found work as a translator of English literature. Hirei was exposed to authors like Oscar Wilde, William Makepeace, and among them Bram Stoker. Hirei was already established as a literary disciple of the poet Kawahigashi Hekigoto. Under him, Hirei had translated The Vampire by John William Polidori, a sister novel to Frankenstein that has established the vampire in literary horror. In 1956, the 54-year-old Hirei embarked on an abridged translation of Stoker's novel. Taichi Hirei's translations are interesting for two reasons, and yes, there were more than two of them. Hirei's father was a theater manager who had exposed him to drama and traditional Japanese performance. Hirei had also been raised by his grandmother, who would tell him Japanese folk horror tales. Hirei once remarked his writing was highly influenced by her use of onomatopoeias. Remember this. When he commenced translating Dracula, he adapted Stoker's writing as an oral performance. In the original novel, the tale is told through journal entries, but Hirei's translation adapted this to verbal storytelling. And Hirei's liberties worked. Taking advantage of the times, his 1956 translation was immensely popular. It set off a boom in Western horror fantasy fiction in Japan. despite being predated by the Japanese film dubs of Dracula and The Horror of Dracula. Harai's novel and characters were unique. They had been totally adopted to Japanese culture and moral ethic. The character of Jonathan Harker was transformed from an English gentleman to a noble adherent of Bushido, thematically of course. Jonathan became the image of a Japanese warrior or samurai protecting his country and friends. Dracula? The Count went from reserved to bombastic. Dracula became more an exaggerated villain for the stage rather than a cold character of English literature. The curse of the vampire became the custom of the no mask. When fighting Harker, Dracula even mocks his nemesis in combat. Stoker's line reads, "Your girls that you all love are mine already, and through them you and others shall be mine. My creatures to do my bidding and to be my jackals when I want to feed. Bah!" Harai's translation?
俺が餌食の欲しい時には奴らは俺の山犬になるおだざまみろ。Mwahahahaha.
Yes. Dracula lets out an anime villain laugh, which serves as a Japanese onomatopoeia, and the word zamamiro in Japanese was an archaic insult even for the time, a heavy kabuki influence on the Count. Now, that's just Dracula in Harai's translation, and after its success in 1956, Harai translated the novel twice more, the revised edition in 1963 and the complete translation in 1971. There is some debate over how much the 1931 and 1958 movies influenced Harai. The way Harai translated some names, though, seems to imply not at all, but the fiction and films are just two parts of the greater whole. For simplicity, I'm going to focus on JoJo Phantom Blood here as a piece of vampire fiction, but some will notice similarities to other media, Japanese, American, or some other. That is likely not a coincidence. The most influential theatrical interpretations of Dracula in both the East and West were Dracula 1931 by Tod Browning, which was based on a stage play, then Terence Fisher's Dracula 1958, or The Horror of Dracula in the United States. Why these two? Because there are a dozen Dracula movies, and also because these are the two most subsequential Dracula movies. Lugosi established the eternal image of Dracula in the 1931 film, and it was the first major Dracula media besides the novel, really. Then Lee bestowed Dracula with a dark sort of romance or sexuality in the 1958 film, and it was the first Hammer film of Dracula. It also gave Dracula prominent fangs. So there's that. Discussing these, it's important to note they depart from the original novel in their own ways. One could make an entire video on that alone, but that is not today's discussion. In writing JoJo in 1987, Araki adopted several of these traits and divergences. A holdover from Harai's translation emerged in Araki's own now famous use of onomatopoeia as a manga artist. The image of Lugosi's Dracula echoes in the early characterization of Dio's megalomania and cruelty. Araki also adapted Dio's personality from serial killers, so the dark charm of Lee's Dracula is also in there. Phantom Blood also uses a similar 1880-1890s European setting as the novel. The conflict in some respects is also similar. Araki desired to show the two ways of living, human and non-human. The struggle between the living and undead is the main dilemma of any interpretation of Dracula or vampire fiction. There are passing similarities one can point to, too. Jonathan Joestar's Japanese pronunciation, Jonathan, is the same as Jonathan Harker's and Harai's Dracula translation, though JoJo was probably named for a Beatles song, or a restaurant. Arena 2 is like Mina Murray, or Wilhelmina, in the novel. Their names are similar, but Dio mocks Jonathan through Arena like Dracula does to Harker through Mina, though Arena's role in the story is far different. Jonathan still fights for her honor. And, while not from Part 1, Dio's final death from the sun in Part 3 is probably an oblique reference to Dracula's death in the 1958 film, the infamous disintegration scene. The video game Eyes of Heaven even runs with this, and has Dio's rings survive his death like Dracula's ring survives his. Is that not general vampire symbolism, though? Well, yes. Phantom Blood makes plenty use of English symbols of horror and occultism, too. The foreign setting was meant to be intriguing at the time. Jack the Ripper is literally a character in it. Then Bruford and Tarkus are references to the English Civil War. They introduced the theme of chivalry, too. There's a lot of English fantasy in Part 1. The Aztec mask that creates the vampires itself may be a reference to the English occultist, John Dee's obsidian spirit mirror. Both are from Mexico, both are objects of occult power, and both could supposedly summon the dead. To add to it, he was Queen Elizabeth's court scientist as well, though I do not think Dee was ever a vampire. Vampires, too, are synonymous with English horror and fantasy. Araki wrote that he wrote Phantom Blood to respond to the demands of an era. Japan was obsessed with Hollywood movies at the time. JoJo is a unique reaction to this. Part 1 is what forged the JoJo franchise's entire identity. At its roots, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is horror fantasy. Araki's storytelling is based on the Ki Shote Ketsu form, a story structure representing introduction, development, twist, then resolution. It is an ancient formula, but it works with modern horror. JoJo meets Dio, JoJo and Dio grow up, Dio turns into a vampire, then JoJo kills Dio with his new abilities and strength. Dio as the antagonist stands the most prominent here. Araki has stated he wrote Jonathan to be as pure and virtuous as possible. That made him rather boring. Dio's evil was meant to be alluring, though. In contrast, Dio is a far more interesting character. It is the same in Stoker's novel. Dracula's powers are meant to be tempting because they are easy and exploitive. Evil offers the easy way out. The powers of the vampire over humanity. Dio is the same. He cannot transform, but he can turn people into servants like Dracula, has an icy touch like Dracula, and shoots eye beams? The truth is, like Dracula, Dio represents the temptations of evil. Evil can be cool. It is cruel, but it can be cool. Dio's outfits in Part 1 are something you could actually see Count Dracula wear. There is obviously some influence from Shin from Fist of the North Star too, but Dio is meant to be like Lee's Dracula, or a Hollywood villain. His vile actions give catharsis to the viewer even if they are disgusted. Poor Danny. Granted, the struggle between light and dark is the oldest human theme. It is literal in the final standoff too. Dio has ice powers while Jonathan has sunlight yellow overdrive. Martial arts and Hamon replace symbols of faith and garlic in Phantom Blood. Instead of faith, Jonathan defeats Dio through friendship. Both Dracula and JoJo employ the importance of chivalry though. One Knight's Loft also returns to normal like the destruction of Castle Dracula and the novel's cut ending. Light wins over darkness. JoJo Part 1 was open to the influence of contemporary movies as the tale was adapted to manga. Not to say Phantom Blood is just Dracula, it is a radically different interpretation of the tale for a different audience. JoJo at its roots is a horror manga. Araki is a self-professed horror fan. He's even wrote a book on it, but I could not find any official or fan translations of it. So I am going off his manga in theory and practice book. If one looks, they can see the signs. Supernatural creatures, odd powers, gruesome gore, and body horror are common in the JoJo franchise. Stand battles operate off of fear and desire to understand the unknown. Though Part 1 is often regarded as the roughest and least interesting, most agree it shines through in its characters. The major ones even inherited the dynamic from Dracula. Jonathan obviously reflects Jonathan. He's an honorable English man who wishes to protect his love, though being noble he has a bit of Arthur Holmwood from Dracula mixed in too. He even shares the Irina Mina love interest. His ability to defeat his enemy is also due to his stiff upper lip. Zeppeli is largely Van Helsing mixed with John Seward. He is a sort of foreign master or guide character that gives the protagonist the ability to defeat Dio/Dracula. Though, unlike the Italian Zeppeli, Van Helsing is Dutch. Yeah, most people forget that. I do not blame them. At the 1931 film, he has this accent.
Should you escape us, Dracula, we know how to save Miss Mina's soul, if not her life.
If she dies by day, but I shall see that she dies by night.
And I will have Carfax Abbey torn down stone by stone, excavated a mile around. I will find your earth box and drive that stake through your heart.
Zeppeli's backstory, though, has a direct parallel in the Dracula novel with the ship the Dementor, which runs ashore likely due to Dracula's interference. In Phantom Blood, though, it is due to the stone mask. Vampires all the same, though. Then there's everyone's favorite. Speedwagon serves the role as a sort of deuteragonist. He's basically Quincy Morris, a rough and tumble adventurer/criminal type character. Instead of a Bowie knife, he has a hat. Morris was an American from Texas. Speedwagon becomes an American and makes a fortune in Texas oil. So, you know, he's a good boy. Though, as Araki has stated in manga and theory, the purpose is to make an appealing character without imitating another. The whole point of him writing Phantom Blood was to show his editors he was not derivative. There was very much a difference between deviation and influence. Phantom Blood is its own unique idea that could stand without Dracula, a radical reinterpretation of the vampire idea, a concept borrowing from Shonen manga, action movies, Dracula, horror, martial arts, and Araki's own interest in culture and artwork. He found his style in Italy after all. Araki, like Hirai, capitalized off a contemporary boom of interest in their respective Japans, Hirai in the 50s and Araki in the 80s. There are plenty of other random observations to make about the later parts of JoJo and Dracula too. The vampire horses of Part 2 may be based on Dracula's horses. Dio turning Vanilla Ice into a vampire in Part 3 is a reference to how Dracula converts people with his blood. Ice is then defeated just like how Dracula was in the 1958 Hammer film. Dio's vampire servants are definitely a Renfield reference. Then Dio's coffin being empty is also a reference to the 1958 film and plenty of other Dracula movies. Giorno is also just one large Alucard reference, mainly to Son of Dracula from 1943, but then Castlevania referenced JoJo, so it might be a reference to both. Not that Giorno being a vampire is ever really important, beside him turning blonde and his Stan's healing ability. Also, I'm ignoring Part 6 Dio because that's an entirely different thing, and Diego Brando is literally a different character. Since the Part 5 anime is ending or has ended by this point, it is also good to look back. See where cultures collide to create things anyone can enjoy, no matter how out there they may seem to most. The fact is, nearly all media draws from different traditions to establish itself as something unique. Just remember, East or West, the Count's bite is far worse than the bark of his children.
You gotta suck out the poison. Dracula don't suck. You're a vampire. Vampires suck blood.
Oh, see, that's a myth. Dracula scrape with his fangs and lick up the blood. Like this. See? Scrape and lick. Scrape and lick.